Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we have a very specific goal. We are going to take the incredibly complex world of pediatric hematologic diseases and coagulation standards, and we're going to translate them into crystal clear, actionable bedside knowledge. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by clotting cascades or strict transfusion protocols, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to break all these concepts down until they are incredibly smooth, seamless, and clear. We're going to make this pathophysiology absolute butter. Let's get into it.
All right, let's just dive right in. This clinical curriculum matrix is basically our professional roadmap for the day. We've got the heavy hitters lined up: hemophilia, DIC, thrombocytopenia, blood transfusions, and phototherapy. This isn't just some textbook list. It's a matrix of essential competencies. We're moving straight from the theory directly into the practical, high-stakes application that you actually need at the bedside. Think of this agenda as your clinical handover sheet for today. We're going to start with hemophilia management, then tackle DIC emergencies, navigate ITP and platelet depletion, cover safe blood transfusions, and we'll wrap the whole thing up with infant phototherapy. Let's get to work. Number 1, pediatric hemophilia management and factor deficiencies. So hemophilia is a group of X-linked recessive bleeding disorders. Basically, the child lacks a crucial protein component like factor VIII in hemophilia A, which means they simply cannot form a stable fibrin mesh clot.
Now, a really high-yield term you absolutely need to drill down on is hemarthrosis. This is the primary threat for these patients. We're not talking about a scraped knee here. We are talking about bleeding directly into the synovial space of a joint. It usually hits the knees, the elbows, or the ankles. This internal hemorrhage into the deep tissues causes severe localized swelling, pain, warmth, and if you don't manage it swiftly, it leads to progressive, permanent joint contractures. Okay, time to bust a massive myth right now. A lot of people think that a child with hemophilia bleeds faster or more heavily than a kid without it. But the actual fact is, they just bleed for a significantly longer duration of time. The vessels get torn, sure, but that necessary fibrin mesh, it never arrives to plug the hole. So that allows a slow, continuous bleed to just steadily fill up joint capsules and deep tissues. Let's put this into a real-world triage scenario. Imagine a 6-year-old boy with severe hemophilia A is brought to you after tripping and falling hard on his knee out at recess. He's crying loudly, and he absolutely refuses to bear any weight on that right leg. When you assess him, that knee is visibly swollen, it's warm to the touch, and his range of motion is practically zero. This is the classic textbook presentation of an acute joint bleed. And in this situation, time is tissue. So what do? You immediately jump to the RICE protocol. First, enforce strict bed rest and immobilize that joint to prevent any further mechanical tearing of those tiny capillaries. Second, apply ice to cause local vasoconstriction. Third, use gentle compression. And fourth, elevate that limb above the heart to reduce to hydrostatic pressure. All while you're doing this, you're also coordinating the immediate IV infusion of recombinant factor VIII. Oh, and a critical reminder, never, ever give aspirin or NSAIDs like ibuprofen to these kids. It inhibits their already compromised platelet function. You stick exclusively to acetaminophen for mild pain. Moving on to Section 2, decoding DIC emergencies or disseminated intravascular coagulation. This is a genuinely terrifying condition where the clotting cascade is abnormally triggered, which obstructs capillary blood flow and rapidly causes multi-organ dysfunction. If you take nothing else away from this section, remember this absolute fact. DIC is never, ever a standalone primary disease. It is always a secondary, life-threatening complication. It gets triggered by a massive systemic insult, like severe bacterial sepsis or major trauma. It's what we call a consumption coagulopathy. The body basically panics, creates so many microscopic clots everywhere that it completely burns through its systemic reserves of platelets and clotting factors. And the result? Sudden, totally uncontrollable hemorrhage. Picture this. It's a high-stakes scenario in the PICU. You're taking care of a 4-year-old with severe meningococcal septic shock. Over just a 2-hour window, you literally watch petechia across the child's trunk merge into massive purple patches. That's purpura fulminans. The peripheral IV site just will not stop oozing, and suddenly there's blood in the urinary catheter bag. The lab values confirm the absolute disaster: prolonged prothrombin time, critically low platelets sitting at 32,000, and highly elevated fibrin degradation products, or FDPs. In a full-blown emergency like this, your absolute medical priority is treating that underlying cause.
So, in this case, pushing IV broad-spectrum antibiotics and vasoactive meds for the septic shock. While that's happening, you're administering fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate to replenish those burned-out clotting factors, right alongside packed platelets. As the nurse, you have to vigilantly monitor renal outputs, making sure they stay above 1 milliliter per kilogram per hour, and you have to handle this patient with extreme meticulous care. Even a gentle bump could cause massive further bruising. All right, Section 3, ITP and platelet depletion, which stands for Immune Thrombocytopenic Purpura. This is an acquired hemorrhagic condition. It typically pops up about 1 to 3 weeks after a standard viral infection. The body produces an autoimmune antibody that accidentally binds straight to the child's completely healthy platelets. 20,000 cells per microliter. That is the ultimate danger zone here. Normally, we're looking at a count well above 150,000. But in ITP, autoimmune destruction drops that number incredibly low. See, when those antibody-coated platelets pass through the splenic macrophages mistake them for foreign invaders and just obliterate them. This rapidly plunges the circulating platelet count under that dangerous 20,000 mark, severely compromising the child's ability to stop even minor capillary bleeding. Let's look at another triage scenario. A 3-year-old girl comes into the ED. Her dad says she's suddenly developed all these pinpoint red dots on her chest and huge purple bruises all over her shins. But here's the catch. There is absolutely no history of trauma. However, she did have a mild stomach bug about 2 weeks ago. Her white blood cell count? Normal. Hemoglobin? Totally normal. But her platelet count is sitting at a critical 14,000. This kind of sudden purpura and petechia in an otherwise healthy kid points straight to ITP. And this brilliantly illustrates how we manage it with a dual approach. On the environmental side, it's all about extreme injury prevention. We're talking bed rest, patting the furniture corners, absolutely no contact sports, and strictly avoiding any rectal suppositories or intramuscular injections. Then, on the medical therapy side, we bring in corticosteroids or IVIG. IVIG is an antibody infusion that actually physically blocks those destructive receptors in the spleen, shielding the platelets so they can survive. Just remember, you've got to monitor that IVIG infusion extremely closely for systemic hypersensitivity. Okay, on to Section 4, safe pediatric blood transfusions and preventing absolute catastrophe. Administering blood products in pediatrics carries immense responsibility. Infants and young kids have remarkably low circulating blood volumes, so your strict adherence to safety workflows is vital to prevent volume overload or a deadly hemolytic mismatch. Here is your non-negotiable pediatric safety workflow. Step 1. Dual verification. 2 licensed nurses checking every single detail of the ID and the blood product. Step 2. Obtain your baseline vitals prior to ever spiking that bag. Step 3 is the critical first 15 minutes. You infuse that blood incredibly slowly, around 2 milliliters per minute, and you stay glued to that bedside to observe. Step 4, hourly monitoring, making sure the entire infusion wraps up within a maximum of 4 hours. 1 degree Celsius, or roughly 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep that number locked in your head. A temperature spike of more than that during or shortly after the infusion is a massive red flag. It is the hallmark sign of a febrile non-hemolytic reaction. This is actually the most common transfusion reaction we see in pediatrics, and it's caused by the patient's sensitivity to the donor's white blood cell cytokines. But what if things go really wrong? Imagine a 12-year-old female with chronic anemia who's receiving packed red blood cells. You did your dual verification, you started the infusion slowly, but just 12 minutes in, she suddenly complains of severe, sharp lower back pain and chest tightness. She starts shivering, her skin is flushed, and her heart rate just rocketed from 82 up to 128. This is a life-threatening acute hemolytic reaction, usually caused by ABO incompatibility. The host's antibodies are literally attacking and destroying the donor red blood cells right inside her vessels. You need to instantly trigger the rule of 3. 1. Stop the transfusion immediately. Halt that exposure right now. 2. Disconnect the entire blood-tainted tubing straight from the IV hub. 3. Attach a totally fresh setup and infuse normal saline. This flushes the line, preserves your precious IV access, and maintains critical renal blood flow. Only after you do those 3 things do you notify the physician and the blood bank, insert a catheter so you can monitor for hematuria, and send that blood unit right back to the lab. And finally, Section 5, infant phototherapy competencies for clearing jaundice. Newborn infants deal with hyperbilirubinemia all the time. It's because they have a naturally high rate of red blood cell turnover, completely combined with structurally immature livers that just can't process it all fast enough. Kernicterus. We treat jaundice incredibly aggressively to avoid this exact catastrophic outcome. It is a severe, permanent, and totally irreversible neurological syndrome. It happens when toxic levels of unconjugated bilirubin cross the blood-brain barrier and deposit right into the basal ganglia. To stop this, we use phototherapy. High-intensity blue-green light causes what's called photoisomerization. That light structurally converts the toxic bilirubin into water-soluble forms like lumirubin, which can easily be excreted in bile and urine, completely bypassing that immature liver. So what's your bedside checklist for phototherapy? First, apply secure, opaque eye protection to shield those delicate retinas. Second, maximize skin exposure. They should be in a diaper and nothing else. Third, assess thermoregulation every 2 to 4 hours because those lights generate some real heat. And fourth, aggressively monitor hydration and strict INO. If you've got a 3-day-old with a high bilirubin of 18.2 who suddenly spikes a 37.9 temp and gets a depressed fontanelle, you are looking at early dehydration. You've got to increase feedings to replace the fluid loss and stimulate bowel excretion. You'll know it's working when you see those loose, bright green stools. So, what does this all mean for us? Think about everything we've just covered today, from spotting a subtle hemarthrosis to halting a hemolytic transfusion reaction in mere seconds, to shielding a tiny newborn from irreversible brain damage. I'll ask you this. Could your vigilance at the bedside be the ultimate defense against a catastrophic coagulation cascade? The answer is an absolute, undeniable yes. Your strict adherence to these nursing interventions, your critical thinking, and your sharp observational skills are what truly make clinical hematology butter. Keep learning, stay vigilant, and always trust your training.